Okay, so I'd really like to welcome Malik Kamdar, Dr. Kamdar from Optum Health. He's going to be talking about a use case of knowledge graphs in life sciences, which likely has some of the largest and most varied data that we'll see. Thanks, Malik. Is that one?
Thank you. Thanks a lot. So thanks for the introduction. Today I'm going to talk about web scale data integration in life sciences and healthcare through knowledge graphs. While I am a part of Optum Health, this talk is focused more on the potential use cases and applications for knowledge graphs in this domains, as well as the challenges and opportunities for knowledge graphs. So doubling time of biomedical knowledge in 1950 was 50 years, in 1980, 7 years, in 2010, 3.5 years, and in 2020, just 73 days. And this doubling time is decreasing continuously after the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of new biomedical knowledge is being published regularly, and biomedical knowledge is expanding faster than the ability for professionals to aggregate, assimilate, and apply it effectively during clinical education, patient care, biomedical research, etc. And so a lot of this knowledge is still being published in biomedicine through unstructured sources. This can be your clinical trials data, scientific publications, preprints, medical textbooks, flowcharts, guidelines, etc. There is a lot of structured knowledge bases out there as well, like drug target knowledge bases, biochemical pathways, epidemiology knowledge bases, etc. In biomedicine, it's not only the knowledge that is expanding, but also there is an expansion of, next slide. There's an expansion of data. There's a lot of new biological data, such as genomics data, proteomics, metabolomics, etc. There is a lot of patient data that is being generated because of the EHR systems, such as lab tests, comorbidities, diagnosis, administered drugs, image scans, etc. There's a lot of sensor data out there, and this is not supposed to be an exhaustive list. There's a lot of other sources, socioeconomic determinants of health, chemical data, etc. Just wanted to highlight that this is a lot of data, this is a lot of knowledge. And for biomedical, next slide. And for biomedical researchers, for clinicians, for patient care, a lot of time what this involves is trying to analyze a lot of this data from different sources simultaneously in conjunction with all the available knowledge that is out there to improve patient care, for their education, for research, and this is definitely a big challenge. And so that brings me to my talk. Knowledge graphs are definitely a great solution to tackle some of these challenges in life sciences and healthcare. But before we delve into that, I wanted to talk a bit more on the hype and the historical context behind knowledge graphs, especially in biomedicine. I'm going to talk about the knowledge graph ecosystem, and I'm going to talk about applications for knowledge graphs in this domains, and finally wrap it up with some of the challenges and opportunities. So let's start with the hype and the historical context. Next slide. So when you think about biomedical data and knowledge, like the most intuitive representation that comes into our mind is an interconnected graph. You can have two different entities like rheumatoid arthritis and methotrexate and a relation between them. You could signify that rheumatoid arthritis is a type of a disease and methotrexate is a type of a drug. And the relation between them is a type has drug. Next slide. Thank you. Sorry, it's an animation that builds out. So if you can just keep on clicking multiple times. And so you could have, you could start incorporating other types of relationships, such as hierarchical relationships, such as Felty syndrome is a type of rheumatoid arthritis. This one? Thank you. Felty syndrome is a type of, is a subclass of rheumatoid arthritis, and the relation between rheumatoid arthritis and methotrexate is like, say, for example, mentioned in this guideline, treating rheumatoid arthritis with methotrexate in the Journal of Arthritis and Rheumatology. and you can start bringing in a lot of other patient data associated with this. For example, the conditions that a patient has, the prescriptions that a patient is taking, and you can start building out this graph. You can start including their family history, their environmental data, their patient's comorbidities, the genes that are associated with the disease, the protein drug interactions, side effects of a drug, drug interactions. So as you can see, this can this can become really a large knowledge graph. Um, and the key thing to note here is that both the biomedical knowledge as well as the biomedical data is changing over time. So none of these edges will remain constant. There will be new edges which are formed, some edges which are deleted, things like that. So definitely, there's a lot of interest in using knowledge graphs. I think as knowledge engineers, our jobs are safe. I would like to say there's a lot of interest in use of knowledge graphs, especially in life sciences and healthcare enterprises. And there's this idea that, oh, every other company is doing it, so we need to use knowledge graphs, and it's an emerging technology for AI innovation, and it's going to solve all our problems associated with data. Well, there's a lot of excitement about knowledge graphs, but there's also a lot of deep history behind knowledge graphs, which a lot of folks are often not aware. And you can like pin down that saying that, okay, there was like a lot of linked data sources out there. The linked open data cloud is still a viable entity. There's a lot of different developments in graph and semantic web technologies in the 2010s. 2001, the semantic web vision was proposed by Tim Berners-Lee. And while everyone in this room is familiar with that history, there is a lot of history in biomedicine itself for knowledge representation. So Deborah mentioned today, there's a lot of investment cycles that led to development of semantic networks and knowledge-based systems and AI inventors and cycles of that. And some of the ideas that were involved from back in the 1970s are similar to what are the ideas that are being proposed right now in terms of knowledge graphs. So these wordings, the domain-specific knowledge, implicit and flexible encoding of knowledge, multiple sources of knowledge, networks, interoperability, explanation of reasoning, these actually are words that I took out from this paper on Sumex AIM from 1970. So these notions about knowledge graphs and these ideas are still were there back then as well. So what is different, and I don't want to take the excitement out of the room about knowledge graphs. I am excited about knowledge graphs in healthcare and life sciences, and I'm sure you are as well. But it's often important to think about knowledge graphs as not just the graph database itself, but the whole ecosystem of tools, techniques, and methods associated with a knowledge graph. And this is more vital, especially when you're designing enterprise knowledge graphs in these domains. So a lot of development around enterprise knowledge graphs often begins with like identifying the new sources of data and knowledge from which to extract and store it in a knowledge graph. But when you are doing that, oftentimes you should always keep an eye out on the end applications. Like, what is your use case? Is it search? Is it decision support, recommendation? We will talk a bit more about some of these applications in the following slides. But it's always important to identify your sources which are useful for your end use case, and not get into the mentality that we're going to build a knowledge graph and people are going to come and use the knowledge graph. That never happens. And so you could think about different sources like public, enterprise, private, secure, popular sources which are open, obviously with licenses like SNOMED, CT, ICD-10, UMLS, UniProt, etc. And I'm talking about knowledge graph ecosystem. So a lot of investment also needs to be made around the extraction and integration steps and processes for integrating and extracting knowledge from all these different sources and storing it into the graph. So this can be either classical integration approaches like ETL pipelines, virtual integration approaches like data federation, OMOP and FHIR are widely used standards as well in healthcare and life sciences. But also automated extractions, like start thinking about how we can bring up like large language models and things for knowledge extractions. And this can be given an unstructured snippet of text. Can we do topic extraction? Can we do hierarchical classification? Can we do relation extraction? Like this snippet is saying conjunctivitis has clinical finding red eye. Can we do evidence extraction for those relations? And once you have identified those, like you could start thinking also about what are the graph databases that you will be using. And I don't want to get into a debate about whether to use a labeled property graph or an RDF triple store. Think what is the best for your use case. And finally, we come to the application. Sorry, go back. There we go. And because we're talking about knowledge graphs in healthcare and life sciences, it is very important to continuously explore and curate your knowledge graph by subject matter experts who are proficient in these domains, but may or may not be aware with semantic web standards or graph query languages like Sparkle or Cypher and things. And so we are thinking about developing tools that could enable your subject matter experts to interact with the knowledge that is stored in the graph. This can be terminology editors, visualization platforms, visual query systems, things like that. And simultaneously, you also need to provide developer-friendly interfaces and services for developers to use the knowledge in the graph in the different applications. So these developers are familiar with like the systems, like search systems or decision support or recommendation, but they may not be familiar with the graph query languages or RDF or representation standards, things like that. So develop API services which can facilitate other developers to use your knowledge graph. And this can be REST, JSON LD, HL7 Fire, things like that. And you might think about having data that cannot be stored in the knowledge graph for either privacy reasons, security reasons, or just like data siloing. So how does your knowledge graph interact with all these other contextual data sources to drive the applications is very vital. And this is an iterative process. A lot of times people forget that once you have developed the knowledge graph, it's done and dusted. And that is not the case because knowledge is ever changing. Requirements may emerge. New applications may need to be developed using a knowledge graph. So this is an iterative process which will require you to go back to the drawing board several times during a year. So I know I'm almost at like 6 minutes. So let's start on some of the applications for knowledge graphs in healthcare and life sciences. And so first and foremost, like one of the most simplest, but it's still a very vital application is like improving document search at the point of care or at for clinical research or biomedical research. Oftentimes professionals need to get precise, updated, trustworthy information from documents for really short queries. So a knowledge graph can help do query parsing, query intent interpretation for like really short queries and get them the right document, which is the most trusted for their work. And things also like think about document recommendation, like oftentimes when a professional is browsing information for a particular page like glioblastoma multiforme, can we use a knowledge graph to recommend additional documents like say the most recent trial around glioblastoma multiforme or the most recent clinical guideline or the clinical calculator associated with a guide with a document. And once you start solving those cases, you can start thinking about more like personalizing this search and recommendations. So can we start using other contextual information around the patient, around their search and browsing history, use it in a privacy first approach to generate personalized search and recommendations for the professionals. And finally, you can start thinking about more complex question answering. Like, say, I am a biomedical professional who is looking for this. What are the for this data for this query? What are the medications prescribed to melanoma patients that have a mutation in their BRAF gene? So a lot of different biomedical entities that are in this particular query, and I'm looking for like precise data sets that can lead me to further analysis. Next slide. And similarly, there are additional use cases both from a clinical pathway point of view as well as for prediction models. So like, for example, for drug discovery and drug repurposing, like there was an amazing talk today. And an idea can be like, can we search the space of all the potential ligands and drugs that we can identify the right set of ligands and drugs which can then be tested for prediction and docking models. Similarly, there is a use case for pharmacovigilance, and this was something that I worked in like 5 years ago now, where we developed a systems pharmacology network by combining drug and protein interaction networks to predict the adverse reactions that manifest on account of these interactions. And this can be a very combinatorially explosive space because there are a lot of different drug interactions and a lot of different protein interactions, and it's a very challenging problem. clinical decision support, like knowledge-driven clinical pathways, can help to provide the recommendation for a particular patient, taking in account all the patient history as well as like the knowledge that is available in clinical guidelines and medical textbooks and things. And so this can be useful for like differential diagnosis, prediction of like recommendation for medications and things. And finally, developing summarization and other prediction models. So this was again a project that I worked 5 years ago, where we wanted to aggregate and all the information that is available for different epidemics like opioid epidemic or Ebola virus disease epidemic, and we wanted to try to visualize it and also use like that information to like analyze patient data. So there's a lot of different applications and use cases, but it's always important to like go back and like understand the knowledge graph ecosystem and like ensure that all the components are satisfied. And one key thing for all these different applications is also that you need to provide developer-friendly API services or other ways for developers to interact with your knowledge graph, even though they may not be familiar with Sparkle or Cypher or Gremlin or things like that. And so these services can be either for like batch processing, like for batch processing of say documents for like semantic annotation, topic identification, generating document similarity, for handling entity linking and normalization in data sets, schema mappings, etc. But this can also be runtime services. For example, query parsing, spell checking, query expansion, doing concept similarity at runtime, pathway inference, things like that. And finally, this can also be more advanced API services that can do like say ML prediction and clustering models, like transferring the knowledge into like 3D docking models, computing data projections, things like that. So a lot of API services that need to be developed when you're thinking about knowledge graphs for use in all these different domains. So there's definitely a lot of different challenges and opportunities. And I apologize for rushing here, but this is a very popular diagram that you must have seen several times. But this diagram is so true in biomedicine, in healthcare and life sciences, because the biomedical knowledge is continuously evolving and expanding with new research and discoveries. So you need to think about automation associated with your enterprise knowledge graphs. Knowledge must be trustworthy and accurate for use in products. So you need to think about your visualization interfaces for subject matter experts. And knowledge can arise from several different heterogeneous sources. So like think about machine learning and see how it can help with knowledge extraction. And when we think about machine learning, there are definitely some challenges in knowledge extraction as well, because medical language in unstructured text itself is very complex. There is a lot of speculation, there is a lot of negation, there is context associated with like certain certain snippets. There's like a multiple entities. And so this was the work that we did in 2019 with a glove embedding model. So it's before the advent of BERT and transformer-based models, and definitely before GPT. So bear in mind, but some of these challenges are still evident because as you can see here, the snippet on status asthmaticus or acute severe asthma does not respond to standard therapy such as epinephrine. So can you infer acute severe asthma has drug epinephrine? Definitely not. But can you infer asthma has drug epinephrine? Maybe. Similarly, another example is just early retrospective studies suggested that reserpine is associated with breast cancer, but prospective studies show a weak association. So definitely not, but your model may lead to such inferences. And once again, as I mentioned, this was done when we used a glow embedding model. So like definitely NLP is getting a bit more advanced with GPT-based models. So I just wanted to put that out there. But when you are storing knowledge from automated extractions in your knowledge graph, you could think about also storing the provenance and confidence metrics directly within the graph. And then a human in the loop can decide when and if to use these relations or this classifications for their downstream applications, depending on the use case and the risk associated with them. And there are other challenges as well. Depending on the use case, this is a use case for like search session classification. So you have a clinician who is coming here with all these different search queries, and they are in a sequential pattern, which can be mapped to different concepts in a graph. And maybe you want to use something like graph neural networks or Node2Vec and things to classify those different search sessions. it becomes a bit more challenging to like represent temporal sequences. And so this is also true for like probabilistic sequences where you want to capture like the confidence or the accuracy associated with a particular detection of like heart rate and things. And in certain cases, especially in decision support or summarization, you may want to like identify all the relevant conditions for, say, diabetes mellitus, and like identify patients that have that. So this can be multiples, if not hundreds of thousands of codes associated with diabetes mellitus in different terminologies. How do you represent all those codes together? And once again, there are options: reification, RDS star, sparkle star, hypergraphs, but it's still a challenge. And there's obviously a lot of duplication that can be associated with doing this, so it's important to consider patient privacy and security and things. And so the final slide, and I personally think this is one of the biggest challenge for enterprise knowledge graphs in healthcare and life sciences, is the social factor, where you need to convince a lot of different stakeholders for buy-in, for development of quality assurance, maintenance, and adoption of knowledge graphs in business products. And you could I think as a community we need to make knowledge graphs more tangible, and we need to invest in the development of user interface development, user experience research, things like that, to make knowledge graphs more tangible for other stakeholders. And with that, I apologize for the speed and the issues with the clicker, but I wanted to wrap that even with all these challenges and opportunities, I'm definitely excited about the use of knowledge graphs in healthcare and life sciences. And we talked about a lot of different use cases really fast. There are a lot of challenges, but that also means there are a lot of opportunities for this community to work on. And with that, I would like to wrap my talk. I apologize for going over.
Do we want to do one or two questions?
Probably shout at you from here. Yeah. So quick question. You mentioned time issues in the graph. Are you able to deal with accuracy or changes in what is true over time? So something that might be true for last month may not be true for 2 years ago or for a year from now. Like, so can you query by different time sets?
Yeah, there are different schools of thoughts on how to like represent the ever-changing biomedical knowledge. Like, so oftentimes like folks think about like adding like verification or using verification to like represent when that particular information was valid and when it was disqualified. And like in sometimes like if you are thinking about like automated process for like knowledge graph development, you can like you could have like ways to like just like have like a flush and replace model where that information that is no longer valid is no longer stored in the graph itself and no longer used for any downstream applications. So there's like multiple schools of thought, and I feel like both approaches are valid. Like it depends on what your end use case is. Like, so if you are thinking about like, say for example, search, you may not want to retrieve the information which is clearly not valid like in 2023, which was valid in 2019. So there's definitely information that you could like lose or put it in a separate subgraph or things like that.
Any other questions?
You mentioned that you were working on kind of like a human on the loop type of scenario for approving like what goes into the graph and what doesn't. How do you deal with like the scale of that? Because there's a ton of content that's coming in, and you'd be limited, with bodies. And I'm just curious how you would deal with that.
That's a good question, and that's a valid question. So like I think it boils down to like knowledge governance. Like there needs to be knowledge, and like especially when you're thinking about enterprise knowledge graphs, there needs to be knowledge governance committees that decide on like certain parts of the knowledge graph, like certain sets of relations which are no longer valid or which were like last generated by a model that was like last trained in 2019 but has not been run since like 4 years now. So a knowledge governance committee within an enterprise can decide whether or not to handle that subgraph within the whole knowledge graph itself. in certain cases, like you might have different methods bringing in relations in a graph using machine learning, automated extraction, and you might store that with different in different subgraphs using provenance metrics and confidence scores, and then the human in a loop can, even though they are both generated by different machine learning models at the same point of time, like a human in the loop can decide whether or not a particular subset of relations and entities is valid for this particular use case or not. And so these are definitely challenges, right? So like there are opportunities to think about it. Like I don't have all the answers in this, but
Okay, well, join me in thanking Malik, and we'll get to our next